Okay, welcome to episode 143 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Karen Wilson. Karen has worked in theatre for many decades as both a performer and a director. She is also a teacher specialising in drama and theatre. She attended boarding school from age 7, which she has documented in her brilliant new memoir called Atrocious Behavior. In the book, she describes the challenges and mistreatment she was subjected to, culminating in being expelled aged 10. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for agreeing to come and speak on the podcast. And as I was saying before we began recording, I found this book really powerful. And it was both enlightening and I could feel a lot of anger as I was reading it, just to hear your story. So I'd love for us to begin by you sharing a little bit about what drew you to write your book of your boarding school experiences.
It was the culmination of two or three things. I was doing an MA on drama and education, and I had a wonderful tutor who encouraged me to use a thing called heuristic research, which is to ask a question in every way possible and to, pursue things like a rabbit down a hole. And the subject was based on a project I'd run for about 3 years, no, maybe more, which was twinning primary schools from very monocultural communities. So, city children, very often Kashmiri Asian from Bradford, and rural children who'd never met anybody different to themselves. And it was a hugely successful project. They would make friends very quickly in bunk barns in the Yorkshire Dales. And I was looking at them and thinking it's so easy to melt prejudice, especially in the young. So I wrote my dissertation on why do people hate each other when they've never met each other. And one of the questions I said to myself, because I'd always said to my children, don't say hate. Hate's a very strong word. If they said, I hate him, because he did this or that. And so I asked myself, is there anybody in my life that I would say I hate? And my thoughts went back to this boarding school. And all of a sudden, the memories just flooded in. And I had to start writing about it, but not much of it belonged in the MA. So I thought I have to put this story down. I have to address it. But also there was an element of talking about dialogue, the power of open dialogue, where you are prepared to be changed by what the other person says and not just a one-sided conversation. And I thought, can I do this? Could I do this with that school? Could I open that out as an adult and really get to grips with what that experience was? So I walked up to the school and I've documented it in the book. It was such a powerful experience. I walked up to the school by myself, no distractions, no music, and just stood there and faced it. And it was so shocking to realize that in the silence of that moment, just standing on a windy open field facing an 18th century Palladian mansion, that my head was so full of the noises and the shouting and the bells, endless bells. And it was a wonderful sort of sense of realization that if it was all inside my head, I have the power to change it. I could do something about it. And so that's kind of when I went home and thought, I'm just going to hole in and write this book. I'm just going to write about this. It took me at least 2 years, I think, before I really found the starting point and started writing. But once I started writing, I couldn't stop. It poured out and it was done rough form in about 3 months, taken a lot of editing since then. But the other factor was that I found myself working in a school that was a special school for children who'd been expelled from all over Yorkshire. And there was a lot of anger, and it was quite a scary place to work. A lot of angry teenagers who'd had horrendous experiences and were totally anti-school. And there was this brief to the teachers to find anything that would coax them back into education and, get them to take ownership of their own lives and make it a positive thing and not something that was done to them. And I just found myself thinking, I was expelled. I was expelled. And, how does that fit? And then there was a story I've told in the book where I found myself just chatting to a 10-year-old. No, he would have been 12 by that time. And just saying, how about primary school? Did you enjoy that? And to cut a long story short, his story was almost the same as mine. He'd been pushed and pushed and pushed by somebody until one day he turned round and lashed out. And from that moment, he'd been labelled this violent, terrible child. And I think he was still as bewildered as I was about that. And I thought, yeah, nobody ever asked me my side of the story. Nobody ever said, what happened? Well, what made you do that? It wasn't like I'd had a history of, having explosions, but I had been pushed beyond coping at the point where that happened. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd love for you to share your story and for you to share whatever pieces you feel are really important for people to hear.
Well, I think I would say that at 7, I was just a bit bubbly and irrepressible. I probably didn't have massive boundaries. Mum was single. We always had teenage au pairs. I think I'd been a little bit feral. My brother had gone to boarding school 2 years before, and life outside of school was just running around the little tiny housing estate where we lived, finding people to play with. I remember that it was other children who taught me how to ride a bike and took the stabilizers off. I'd been very free. And then all of a sudden, there was this world of rules and stiff, uncomfortable uniforms. There was a woman I met in my 20s who remembered me at this school, and she'd been like 3 years older than me, and she was a prefect. And she said, I just remember you running hell for leather across the main hall and me barking at you, stop running. And she said, and you at age 7 just turned around and went, why? Just simply that. What's the problem? I think that's how I was. I don't think I was a particularly over the top child. I think I just couldn't quite fit with the rules. But the main battleground, was nighttime. And I look back now and I think, how on earth, what were they thinking to put 10, 7, 8-year-olds in the same room and then to shout at them to get into bed, flick a switch off and say, right, lights out, no talking. How does that work? Having seen children on sleepovers now, I just think it was a recipe for disaster. And it must have been in every prep school where there were very young children full of energy who hadn't wound down in any way, shape, or form. There's an art to getting a child to slow down and go to sleep. It takes a bit of work, but it's so worth it if you can achieve a peaceful, happy bedtime without, conflict. And I think many parents reach out and look for help in how to do that. So yeah, I was just endlessly in trouble. And I think the main story is that it started right from the beginning. It escalated in year 2, but by year 3, the punishments had gone to a new level. And the creative efforts that these women who ran the upstairs went to terrify and subdue restless and excitable children just went too far. way too far. And I remembered so many of them so well. So the main one was, right, get up out of bed, everybody down into the stone hall where it would have been semi-dark, great big, very much similar to the entrance hall to Castle Howard, great big
Mm.
cold stone hall, and stand facing the wall in silence, and being patrolled. And then having the staff members who walked past making comments like, I always knew that one was a bad one. And it doesn't surprise me. And, the sort of abusive comments that used to come. So you were shamed constantly. And when that didn't work, it was get up, get dressed, and walk round the large square garden outside the house. So I don't know. I think the circumference would have been half a mile. And one of the fun memories that I remember was a new girl got really upset. She was finding this far too much homesickness, I guess. It completely overtook her. And she was crying uncontrollably. She just wanted to go home. And I've said, my whole narrative at that time of my life was in musicals. And one of the key ones was The Sound of Music. And I think it was me, but it might have been somebody else, said, we should sing. That'll make her feel better. So we did. We said, what can we sing? And we tried to think of something that we all knew, and we hit on a Christmas carol. I think it was about November. So we all started singing a Christmas carol. And actually, it really did feel good. But the matron heard us from her third floor window. She was livid. She opened the window and screamed, how dare you? She heard this joyful sound. She said, right, for that you can run. And that was it. We were running around four sides of the square, and we really were getting exhausted by that time. And this child actually started getting asthma. She was panting. She was really in trouble, and we were feeling guilty that we brought that on. That we caused that. It has to be said, when I went to the reunion earlier this year, that was the first thing other girls were talking about as well, was that episode. And how we felt we were very clever, because there was an incline, a hill, towards the back of that garden. And if you lay down on the hilly slope, you couldn't be seen from the main house. So we organised how we would cluster together and drop one person or two, and they could stay there until we'd done another whole circuit, and then we'd pick them up and drop another two. And we felt like we were in a World War II film, that we were kind of beating the system, which again was just one way of feeling a bit better about it. So yeah, there was the teamwork and the ingenuity. That's something I remember very fondly. But when I think of the matrons, I just think, why were they working with children? They certainly didn't seem to like very much. I don't know. And it was miles from anywhere, right up on the middle of the North York Moors. So, I wonder what caused these young people to be in this boarding school caring for these children, supposedly. And
Mm.
yeah.
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 It's
It's
interesting.
interesting.
As I was reading the book, it just felt like torture is what they were putting you through. It felt like some form of concentration camp. The night after night after night of worse punishments and just the cruelty. And yeah, definitely a part of me, it's like, yeah, I felt very angry as I was reading it. And it's like, I
Mm,
just can't believe a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old children being put through this. And it sounds like the first headmaster seemed quite nice.
mm,
He lasted a year and then he retired, and you had for the next couple of years a more harsh husband and wife. And
mm,
some of the stories of how the wife treated you,
mm,
um, it's like, yeah, Why are they in charge of children?
Well, I think there were probably children who she really liked, the ones who were well behaved. But I think my reputation preceded me. I think any new teacher had been told, she's trouble. And I always found that so deeply disappointing because whenever a new face emerged, I used to think, right, I'm going to get it right now. I'm not going to be in trouble anymore. And then somehow I would get past nine different, sort of lineups and, all the different structures we had to do. And then it would go wrong again. And as soon as I was caught talking again or caught playing a game when I shouldn't have been or whatever, it was like, yeah, you've always been trouble. And it just escalated. I just couldn't seem to shake off that image that I was the bad one. I think there were probably other children who felt exactly the same, but I carried that with me for a very long time, I would
Mm,
say.
yeah, I'm
I
so
think she
sorry.
just couldn't stand me. I think she just found me irritating and, a problem.
Mm,
And it's one thing to be without family, without love, but to know that the adults who are looking after you actively dislike you is harsh.
yeah, and I think her words were, if I remember correctly, something like "I'm going to break you," or
So there were many, many times when that sort of thing came out. I think she said, I'm going to break that spirit. She said, you have a nasty, evil spirit in you, and I'm going to break it. So you might as well get used to that idea. That was the tone of it. It was basically, I will win, whatever it takes, and you will behave and you will do exactly as you're told, and you will stop, disrupting whatever it was, the line, or talking after lights out, or um, being caught out of bounds. That was another big. There were so many places you weren't supposed to go, and you couldn't help yourself as a child. If somebody said, "Under no circumstances can you walk up that big staircase," you'd have a go. You had to.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and some of the rules, the bells, and how it was so structured and so rigid. You had, I think, in the morning you mentioned that it's like a bell to get up, a bell to then, go
Get
to
to
the
the washroom,
bathroom. It's like,
a bell
what?
when you should be dressed, a bell to line up, waiting in line, to a bell to lead off downstairs. And we all poured out and had to run right round the square, then a bell to go up for breakfast, and then wait on this long red carpet in the hall, and then finally this dirty great big gong that would be rung to say the meal was ready. But at each point where the entire school was lined up together, it would be, we're waiting for everybody to be still and silent. It was so many times, before you'd even got to breakfast, you'd had three significant major lineups, and you might have got it right the first two. And then by the third one, somebody had told you a joke and you were laughing your head off, or somebody had tripped somebody up and it was really funny. Yeah, children are children, they will play. And, there's a limit to how many times you can ask a 7, 8 year old just to stand still and face the front and not do anything. That's how
Yeah.
I feel now. I mean, I've taught primary school, I've taught that age.
And what's your perspective now to look back on your experiences at boarding school and how it was with the bells, the routine, the discipline, having been a teacher in a primary school?
Mm. So I actually taught secondary for many years. I transferred to primary because I wanted to let go of the pressure of GCSEs and A levels, which is a whole other story. Um, but it was an incredible moment. I was employed to teach drama all the way through the school, right from 4 years old up to 11. But they said, we're going to have to give you an English class as well. So that's 1 hour every day. And it was year 3, 7, 8 year olds. Now, I'd seen my children go through this age, But stepping into a class of 7, 8-year-old children and seeing how they were and what stage they were with their writing, storytelling, it was overwhelming. It really was. Just they're little children. They are incredibly jumpy, not really very fond of sitting still and writing for very long. There would always be 2 or 3 who were. In every class, you get massive diversity. You get the ones who are fascinated by writing and stories. You get children who live for sport, others who, are just desperate to get out to playtime and continue a made up game that they started the day before. Others are great designers, but they're different and they are full of energy, I think is the basic thing. So with English, because I had this thing, the experience I had, I just used to look for any excuse to get up and role play or move or make up a story, act it out, rather than actually sitting behind a desk for the entire time. And that helped. That helped. And I hated the lining of them up as well. But I realized, in order to get a whole class of children through 4 fire doors and 3 corridors, it was going to have to be something. So I went back to Oliver again, which was the other musical I knew backwards. And I used to sing Fagin's song. The one, Cheerio, we'll be back soon. It starts off with Fagin shouting, line up, and they all have to line up behind. They'd shout, line up, single file, quick, march, quick, march. And they would chant with me, and we would march down the corridor to the consternation of the other staff. So that was a thing. There were so many moments, even as a teacher, where I would get into trouble for being too noisy or having a class that was role playing its way down the corridor.
Mm. And it sounds like you shared towards the end of your book about, what happened more recently, about 3, 4 years ago, when that head teacher, again, that almost that shaming that kind of went on. It almost sounded like it's the same thing as what happened at school.
Yeah. What was really helpful was by the time that happened, I had been immersed in reading Nick Duffel, in reading Joyce Chavrin, in listening to your podcasts, and I had a real sense of what triggers were in my life. So I wasn't completely shocked when that completely floored me. And it was a simple feeling of the same injustice that I'd felt as a child. It was in towards the end of the first year of lockdown. And I'd done everything that everybody else had. I was wearing masks and putting grids on the floor to keep children so many sort of feet apart, doing all the things that should be done. And we'd had a long, tiring day rehearsing children in the main hall to video them because there would be no performances at Christmas. And they were tired and irritable. Everybody was feeling the stress of all the different rules that had been put in place. It was a very hard time for young children as well as everybody else. And I was looking for a game. I know I've always been used to working this way. What's the game that would get everybody going in this moment? And I suddenly thought of one that I'd played 100 times that I thought this always gets children laughing and having fun. It was a silly game where one child is blindfolded and everybody has to use their silliest voice to say, "Good morning, Your Majesty." And the child with the blindfold on has to guess who's speaking. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. And before I knew what I'd done, I always wore these long cardigans as a teacher, and I always had a colourful scarf draped over the top. I'd done this 100 times. I whipped off the scarf because I didn't have a blindfold with me and used it as a blindfold. I think actually as I left school that day, I probably had a thought, blimey, shouldn't have done that. We're not supposed to be touching anybody. We're not supposed to be sharing clothes. There were so many rules in place anyway. The school made it into a forced 10 disciplinary hearing, threatened me with um, being dismissed with a terrible record. And I'd never been through a disciplinary process. I don't know how I'd got to my late 50s without ever really understanding what that was. I always thought it was for, teachers who had gone beyond the pale, who shouted at a child or hit them or shared something inappropriate. I don't know, it was in the back of my mind. But anyway, the process of it was horrendous. It was written statements and recorded phone calls, and then this formal hearing with witnesses. And I was told I had to have a union. And I went into shock. It's as simple as that. I went into complete shock. My nervous system went into overdrive. I couldn't sleep. I had massive adrenaline rushes. Um, yeah, and I realized I wasn't coping. And I ended up seeing a doctor who signed me off. Um, and I managed to go back eventually, but it was never the same. I never really coped after that. I thought, what am I doing? This is, being a teacher. I'm laying myself open to being triggered by the experiences I had at school. I need to look for other ways. So now I teach out of school again. I still love drama. I still love kids, but I don't want to be in the school system anymore. I feel like I've earned that.
Yeah. Yeah. As you shared the story in the book, I mean, there's certain psychologists that I've interviewed and I've listened to since talking about COVID is that the children were traumatized during that time. They're carrying a lot of trauma and it's playing out by being expelled age 5 or 6 or struggling interacting with other children, socializing, and how many people were traumatized by that
Yes.
experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, I was a scout leader during that time, and I just took I was looking after 15 to 18-year-olds, and we just, after that first lockdown where no one was meeting, but from the second one, from say September onwards, we met in the woods, we had a fire, and we cooked food, and it was like we played games and we checked in, and it was just so important and so
Mm,
healing to do that.
mm,
And that was a real lifeline for them. And I
mm,
think the first time we met in say August, one boy was saying, "Oh, I haven't spoken to anyone apart from my mum and dad for whatever since March, so it's almost 6 months."
mm.
And you're like, really?
Yeah.
And I just think, yeah, I look back on it and I really feel as a country we didn't deal with it very well. It was kind of very much a trauma response. Um, yeah, so yeah, I think it was so much pressure on the children and then so much pressure on the adults as well, and
Mm,
especially in schools. So yeah, I'm sorry to hear of your experiences. Mm. So I guess one of the things that you talk about quite a bit in the book is about some of the punishments. And you mentioned one of them, the skipping. I'd love you to share some of your ex because I think as people listen to this conversation, that's going to trigger something within them that they're going, I forgot about that.
mm.
So I'd love you to share
Yeah.
some.
Well, the one that everybody remembered when I went back for a reunion just earlier this year, which was a story in itself, was that once we were upstairs and there was the whole routine of dressing gowns and washrooms and bath routines and what anybody caught doing anything, and I can't even remember what we would have done, meant that you had to lie face down on the central carpet in the long corridor with your arms by your sides. And it was a smelly carpet. Everybody remembered that. And as other girls were going to and fro from dormitories to washrooms, they were stepping over these bodies, and it was just a thing, and it was every night there was somebody there. So that was one of them. There was the after lights out thing, but the story that I remembered that I'd enjoyed telling for years before I even thought of writing was the second head teacher sort of called me in and said, right, come with me, put your PE kit on. I thought, blimey, now what's happening? And he fished out a skipping rope and he said, you're going to stand in the middle of the main entrance hall and skip until I tell you to stop. I thought, right, okay. I was quite a good skipper. So I just stood in the entrance hall and started to skip. And it was playtime for the rest of the school. And somebody comes up and, looks at me in my PE kit. What are you doing? Well, I've got to skip. Oh, she said, I'll go and get my skipping rope. And off she went. And then as soon as there were two of us, somebody said, this one? I can do cross skip like this. And then, although I wasn't allowed to join them, before I knew it, there was, a team doing double skipping and seeing if they could do it on one foot. And everybody was sharing skills. And I just have this wonderful memory of seeing the headmaster leaning on a stone pillar at the edge of the entrance hall with his head in his hands to say, what do I do with this child? This is now a party. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Yeah, that was fun. That was fun. It was so worth it, the look on his face. And it was just, yeah, that was a bit of a win. But there were many others that you would be prosecuted for as a teacher now. I mean, I remember once going through a staff training where they talked about how shame is an unacceptable way of punishing a child. And there was like a 20-minute discussion between the teachers as to whether telling a child they had to sit on a bench at the edge of the playground for 5 minutes constituted shaming, or was that, a reasonable sanction for a kid who'd been fighting or getting, doing something they shouldn't. And it just sent my mind back to the amount of times that they wanted to isolate you in a way that showed you up to the entire school, that framed you as the bad one. And these were relentless. I can remember once being told I had to stand in the middle aisle in chapel for the entire evening service. So while everybody was standing up, sitting down, kneeling, singing hymns, I had to stand there just so that I was framed and visible to the whole school. This is a bad child and she is, under punishment. There was the one where at some point I was the only one caught talking, or maybe I wasn't, I don't know, but she made me get up, get dressed, and go and stand outside in the middle of the square on my own. And I have such a clear memory of the thought processes that were going through my head. I was stood there staring at this 3-story building, and I could see her light on, the one who'd put me there. And I could see who else was moving in the school. And I was so aware that the deal was she wanted me to be terrified. So my job was not to be terrified. And I remember listening to the owls and the other birds and sounds coming from the woods that were on 3 sides behind me, and thinking, she won't get to me. She won't get to me. But I look back at that now and think, what were you thinking? What were you thinking? There were so many things. There was another matron who used to basically give you something to learn off by heart. So 4-verse poem. You stand out there and you can go back to bed when you can recite it off by heart. And mine was, I remember learning Sea Fever, top to bottom. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky. And, I would rattle it off. And then when I did it for her, she said, you just murdered a beautiful poem. And I thought, what were you expecting? The deal was I was supposed to learn it off by heart. He, the headmaster, used to do it with Latin verbs. And as I was writing it, I remember thinking the one thing that I remember from that time, amo, mas, amat, amomus, amatis, amant. That was the first set of verbs we had to learn. I love, you love, she, he loves, they love. And just the irony of that. Nobody loves anybody in this place. Nobody loves me anyway. But yeah, it was just new and creative, inventive ways. I've talked about the fact that just before the big incident, I was isolated. I was put in a separate um, little tiny cupboard under the stairs. The light didn't work. It was right at the point where a sort of anti-bird net was slung above the huge portico on the outside of the building, and there was a dead bat and a dead bird, and that's what I was staring at night after night. And this thing sent to Coventry.
Mhm.
I hadn't really thought about it, and I think I heard you mention it in a podcast, and I suddenly thought, have I ever looked up what that was about? Apparently, because I mean, lots of people I know that term from childhood. Being sent to Coventry is to ostracize somebody, to isolate, to cut them, to refuse to communicate with them. And it's something that children might do to each other when they fall out, but it was used as an actual punishment from adult to child. And I look back on that now and think that was cruelty beyond pain. It really was. So it was an order. Nobody's allowed to talk to you. And that would be commanded. Nobody talks to this child. You're not allowed to hold a conversation in the washroom. You're not allowed to go into anybody else's dormitory, when everyone's buzzing about with the evening routines. And if you're in the queue for break time snacks or whatever, nobody's allowed to talk. And apparently it actually does come from Coventry. It comes from the Civil War when there were royalist prisoners in a parliamentary town. And the instruction to the townspeople was that no one should communicate with these people. They should ostracize them completely. And they shouldn't, offer them food or drink. And that's been handed down through generations of children as a phrase that means to cut somebody out completely. Yeah, I think that one was probably the one that bit deepest. And then the worst trouble I ever got into was because I broke it. I actually was caught talking to another child, and that's when all hell broke loose.
Mm. Thank you. I almost feel, looking at investigations, we talk about sexual abuse or other things. Your stories, for me, they're criminal. Some of them,
Mm,
you mentioned the word there. The lady wanted you terrified.
mm,
It's like you're a 7 and 8 year old child. You've been put outside. This is cruelty beyond belief. This is, yes, it wasn't necessarily the physical violence that was happening in the boys' schools,
mm,
even though that still happened in your school. But some of the things, and being sent to Coventry, I mean, that's like a torture you would find in something like, some prison or
mm,
where no one's allowed to talk to you. It's like solitary confinement. It's like you're a prisoner. There's something wrong. And it's Mark Stauffer from the Lost Boys of Dilworth. He shares about his story of being sent to Coventry, where for a week no one will talk to you.
yeah.
And I think as a child, one of the most important things to develop psychologically is to be seen, to be heard, to be actually noticed. So if you're cutting that off, plus you don't have your parents,
Mm,
I mean, I think over the next few years, I think we're going to redefine what abuse is.
yeah.
And I certainly, I mean, this came out in the 90s. This was the work of David Howe and this paper written Ne Fung Wicked, which talked about neglect being even more damaging to the developing child and its brain than acute abuse. And as you saying in your story, a lot of it was just abject neglect. You said, I think it's on page 19, bored, cold, and hungry,
Yeah.
you know. And how did they keep you warm when you went back to the school? Because you had no heaters.
Mm,
And and you're like, we just don't think of these things. I mean, I live in Yorkshire. It's freezing in winter. And if you've got no heating, I mean, what were they thinking?
yeah.
To have little children in there. And yeah, yeah, I feel, yeah, quite passionate. And it's like, what are they doing? What on earth are they doing?
I mean, pastoral rules did eventually get brought in with the Children Act. Um, and, I think a lot of boarding schools nowadays have been told that children must be able to decorate a personal space, put up family photographs, have personal things around them, and that there needs to be a pastoral care team. I was thinking about it before we talked, and I was thinking, I don't think I really learned the term pastoral until I was an adult. And I always associated it with a vicar of a parish,
Mm.
having a pastoral role. But it was only when I actually worked inside of school that I realized, that you have a pastoral team, that you have people who have responsibility for the welfare, and children know that they can go and talk to them. And I've met some great pastoral leaders. Not everybody takes it on as a massive vocation, but some really do. And it's a hugely essential role. But in those days, there was absolutely no one to go to. There was nobody who was on your side. So you had to work it out for yourself. And I don't think it ever occurred to us. I mean, a lot's been written about this, to go home and say this is outrageous. But I don't think my brother did either. His school was brutal. I knew that. And I think he told me. I think we used to exchange stories as children. I don't think it ever occurred to us that the adults in our lives would be as outraged as we were.
Yeah, and
That's just how it was.
it sounds like from what you say in the book with your mother is whenever you try to broach the subject with her, she would always bat it off. Certainly as you got older.
Yeah.
And I've heard so many dozens, if not hundreds of stories and read of children who've written home and they think they've written home once or twice, but it's actually been 15, 20 times. And the parents have just ignored the letter, the cries for help of please take me out of this place, please take me out of this place.
Mm,
And always the parents is, oh, it'll get easier.
mm,
And I'm thinking of my own mother when my father had died before I came across boarding school syndrome. He was an ex-boarder himself.
mm.
With my mother, she didn't really want to listen to my experiences. And I was in my 30s and I just started to shout. And I never shout. So
Yeah.
she listened and I kind of made her listen to what had actually happened in that school and how it affected me. And but most parents will not listen.
I always got the impression in those later years, because I mean, mum was quite vulnerable. She'd boarded from 7. And thinking about it, she had her own breakdown. She completely caved in when she turned 40, which was hard for us as teenagers to witness. And I felt like she couldn't cope with it. And I didn't want to push it because I think through her own breakdown, she probably had come to an awareness of how hurtful her early years were. She was always in trouble too. She used to say, "Oh, you're just like me," which wasn't helpful actually. I don't think she could cope with it. Um, it was what it was. But then, as I've written, in my case, felt like all the children I knew were going to boarding school. My brother had gone, my cousins were going. Most of mum's friends had children who were packing trunks and, coming back in little uniforms like little army sergeant majors. It was the norm. It
Mm.
was the norm. And it felt unfair to kind of, come at her with the full force of an adult blaming her. I mean, I think she did what she thought you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
I also don't think she had much confidence in herself as a parent, especially as a single parent. The phrase "the good enough parent" hadn't been invented yet, and I don't think Mum thought that she had enough to really know how to raise a child.
Yeah.
But she
Yeah.
struggled with confidence.
Mm. I have often heard that from people who've sent their children to boarding school, saying, I got to age 8, the children got to age 8, and then it was like I didn't know how to parent them. So
Mm,
it's like, right, I'll send them to boarding school.
mm,
And it's so sad. I mean, likewise, a lot of my friends, because I grew up Portsmouth and a lot of them was military. My father was military. A lot of them went off to boarding school with 7, 8, my friends. So I kind of lost that connection. I think I would have gone younger, but my father was invalided out of the Navy, so he wouldn't have got a bursary to send me to boarding school. And they've changed that now. So a lot of my friends went off. I went to the local grammar school and then age 11 was sent to boarding school. And yeah, I think maybe that's feeling very cut off from Portsmouth. Because I went off to school, I lost touch with the friends who I had there, and obviously those who I'd been friends with who'd gone to boarding school, I lost touch with them as well.
That was a big part of it. That's something that I only really noticed when I had children growing up and going to a local school in a village, was just looking in awe at the social life they had and
Hmm.
thinking, wow, that really was something I missed out on. There was nobody to play with at the holidays. We didn't know anybody. It was 9 months of the year. So I basically, there was me and my brother, and we would get together with cousins. But I couldn't make any friendships that would really, that I could go back to. Because we would scatter to the four winds in the holidays. Everybody lived all over the place. I don't know where half the children I went to school with lived. Um, yeah, and it's a massive part of childhood. And again, I only witnessed it when I was raising children myself. And they would come bursting out of school. Can so come for tea? Can I go to his house? We're going to football, but his mum says she'll take me. Like, yeah, fine, bring them in, one more sausage or whatever. And it was just so easy. You would negotiate with somebody else's mum, and either they'd take one of yours or you take one of theirs. And there was this just constant social life. They all met at Cubs or Scouts, they all met at football. And they still have the friends that they had when they were at primary school. They're both away now, but they come home and they get together and they say how precious it is to have friends back in Yorkshire who absolutely know them from
Hmm.
the year dot. So that when stuff arises, when they, really need to sort of share something, there's no groundwork to do. They have friends who've known them ever since they were in primary school. And, their favourite thing to do is, like I said, light a bonfire. We have a big fire pit in the middle of our garden. We just load it with old stuff and they'll sit round it playing their music and chatting and sort of putting things to rights. It's wonderful. I'm so happy
Mm.
for them that they have that. And I look at it with awe and think, gosh, that would have made a big difference.
Yeah. It's that community. I think Nick says in either The Making of Them or trauma abandonment privilege, this idea that people say boarding schools are community. He says, no, a community is all ages.
Yeah.
And it's adults, it's children, whereas boarding school, it's not a community,
No.
it's an institution.
Yeah.
And I think, I've heard, you know, since doing this work, quite a few people from my school have reached out to me and they say, oh, I'm not in touch with anyone from school. And I hear this quite often. I'm in touch with, one other guy from my school, who, and Anne Power said something interesting. I think it was last year's Boarding School Survivors Conference, which is happening in another month's time. And she was saying that often, if we've been through like a war situation, we create very strong bonds.
Mm,
And she was saying that boarding school was similar, that it was like almost, it's like a war situation,
mm,
and it creates strong bonds if we manage to keep them
mm,
with the people. What I found quite difficult at the beginning, I think I came across Nick's work in my 20s, and
mm,
none of my friends had. And I was going, it was, oh my God, do you remember that? That's
mm.
horrific. That's trauma. And they're like, no, it wasn't. It was good. I'm like, and so we kind of went separate ways. But now, over the last few years, we've come back and they're kind of starting to realize, oh, yeah, you're right. That was abuse. That was
Mm.
neglect. That was. Um, but I have noticed that I have a really strong bond with this one friend because of what we've been through.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, I was ejected under a very dark cloud from this first one.
mm,
And what was quite shocking was that after I wrote the book, I discovered that not only, anybody in the school, but most of my family didn't even know I'd been expelled. It was very hushed up. It must have been explained in another way. But when I got together with some of the women who I hadn't seen for 50 years, I remember thinking, gosh, they've really, some of them have forged real friendships because they went on to the age of 13 when they possibly had the ability to network with each other outside of school a bit more. But I left under such a cloud. That never happened for me. I did have friends from other boarding schools, but again, hard to maintain if you don't live anywhere near the school. My third boarding school was in Hertfordshire, and quite a few of the women who went there are London based and they network with each other. And once in a while, I've dipped into that. And yeah, there is a bond there. But people do tend to come up with the stories. And there are sort of two camps, the ones who say that was outrageous and it should never have happened, and others who are like, oh, it was the best years of my life. And I asked that of Joy Chavrin when we talked, when I very first finished the book. And I said, I have moments of real doubt as to whether I just am really negative about something, when others say to me, oh, go on, but we had so much fun, didn't we? And it was all wonderful. And she said, yes, there are people who will say that. But she said, but my experience is that you only need to go a little bit deeper and actually ask them a simple question. Did you miss home? Or, you know, something to that. And you will find that some people have just chosen that narrative, but it's not always the case.
mm, thank you.
You have to stay with your own story, don't you? I know what mine was.
Yeah. And the more I look at psychology this and psychiatry is this idea of mirror neurons. And mirror neurons basically says that if I see someone being hit, my brain centers, the pain centers are um, they're kind of turned on in the same way as if not actually more than if I'm being hit myself. So if someone's being punished or shamed, we receive that same pain. So when people say to me, "Oh, nothing happened to me," and I'll often say, "Did you ever see anything?" And they say, oh yeah, I saw people being beaten up, and I'm like, well, that would have affected you as well. And and I think it's, yeah, I mean, there's so many levels to it now. I mean, I spoke to Mark Sunderland a couple of weeks ago, and he's a specialist in addictions, and he said stress, he gave an equation, stress without attachment equals trauma. So whether they liked it or not, there was a lot of stress in that school, whether it's pressure. And because there was no attachment, you just had to do it all yourself. It
mm,
therefore becomes trauma. And
mm,
that's what I see. We've learned to dissociate. And what Mark was just pointing out, that the most two overrepresented areas in addiction work are early boarders and adoptees. And the reason he gives for that is because they've been told it's good for you. There's no way of them processing it, no way of going and letting go. It's like, oh, it's good, it's good, it's good. And
mm,
they have to overcompensate. So yeah, I agree that I think there are a certain amount of people who it won't have affected them, but I think it's very small. I think 5% possibly
mm,
are not negatively impacted by boarding school. And that's just the more research I do, the more stories I read. I have 60 biographies, as I said at the, before we began. I think there's only one which doesn't have a story of some form of abuse, or you would say it's criminal.
mm,
You know, Tony Blair, he was a lawyer going back into Edinburgh, and he was at a meeting and he wouldn't go into one of the rooms. And his colleague was like, why? And he says, one of the boys in there is one who used to beat me. I will not go into this meeting unless he's thrown out, or something along those lines. And I'm like, wow, it's still affecting him in his 30s and his 40s.
mm.
So, yeah. So, would you like to share your side of the story of your expulsion? So,
Sure. Yeah. So, so I'd been put in isolation. I'd been sent to Coventry. She began to proclaim that if I was to be caught talking one more time, the consequences would be like something nobody had ever seen before. And I remember thinking, she's got something up her sleeve, and I can't think what it was. And the hardest part of this is it wasn't until I had a reunion with a teacher that I discovered that she'd asked permission to wallop me, basically. And she'd been told yes. I'd been obviously told at home it was uncontrollable. And so I was caught talking. It was around wash time, and I had thought nobody was looking, and I'd slipped into a dormitory and I was having a conversation with another girl. I thought she hadn't seen me, but as I emerged out into the corridor, which was a long corridor that stretched the whole of the first floor, she grabbed me in a vice-like grip and said, now we will see, big booming voice. So everybody stops what they're doing. What the consequences are for a child who will not obey. She made this big theatrical thing of it, pulled me into that room, and basically, I suppose it was just an old fashioned spanking. She just hauled me over a knee and walloped me for as long as she wanted to. It seemed to go on forever. And then she gave me this other long lecture about what a wicked, evil, terrible child I was. And one way or another, she was going to make sure that blah, 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 blah. And that really got to me. It was, this whole power thing, but being so physically overpowered, which hadn't really happened before, was, yeah. And I guess it was only in my 50s that I saw that as a progression for what happened next. And it was probably about 2 weeks later. I was out in a sports lesson, and the games mistress said, oh, you've gone faster than you went last week, so you should record that in your class book. Oh, it was, something to be proud of. I was, yeah, very happy. So I went off to this table at the back of the athletics ground, picked up the book, wanted to write in it. And another girl came up and said, I'm the book monitor, and you can't write in that book. I have to write anything that goes in that book because I'm the book monitor. Yes, how kids are. We would have been 9, 10. And I said, get off. It's as my record, and I'm going to write it in. And the teacher told me to. So it was a typical child argument. She was pulling rank on me because she had been given a job to do and she wanted to do it. And I was not giving way. And before I knew what had happened, they'd been making me wear my hair up in these little bunches, which I loathed. I felt humiliated by it. I'd never had to wear that sort of hairstyle before. Somebody came up behind me, grabbed hold of one of my pigtails and yanked it as hard as they could. And my whole head went backwards. And it was a knee-jerk reaction. I just turned round and went baff with my right hand. And I thought it was another child, but it wasn't. It was the games mistress. And it was her way of interrupting me having an argument with this other girl. But before I knew what I'd done, I'd whacked her across the face with the back of my hand. And then there was utter silence. Everybody froze. It was like a pause on the television. And I remember the echo of what is going to happen next. I didn't know whether she was going to lay into me. I mean, teachers did hit out, not as richly as the matron had, but they did hit. She just said, get out of my sight before I kill you. And I remember walking very slowly, very carefully back to the school, which was empty because everybody was in classes. And just the shock of what I'd done. I was so confused. I was so confused. I didn't see myself as a violent kid. I'd certainly had scraps with my brother. He was 2 years older, and he could get very physical, as he did with his friends at school, and that came home, and, we sometimes physically fought over things. But the way I was treated in the days leading after was like, what do we do with this terrible, dangerous, nasty child? And what they did was put a big ornate armchair in the centre. It was always the centre of the main hall, great big tiled floor, 2 stories. And I was told to sit there. So people would line up on the red carpet to go that way or that way, and I was just on show. They would come pouring in from break time, and they would have to go past the hall to go downstairs. And if it wasn't lesson time, I was sitting on that chair. Then again, nobody was allowed to talk to me. Nobody was allowed to interact with me. And it went on for days. And I think I just went numb. I just went completely numb. It ended with my parents, my mum and my brand new stepfather being called in. And they wanted to expel me there and then. She argued that I was probably a bit disturbed because she just got married. And that was seen as reason enough for them to defer it till the end of term. But I wept and pleaded, said, I don't want to be here anymore, don't make me stay. And she said, you could, but there's nowhere for you to go at home, so, you have to stay here. It's just till the end of term, and then, we never talked about that. But I can remember at that point, I didn't cry often as a child. I can remember crying like my heart would break. Just take me away. I think she must have said, all this isolation stuff has to stop. Because all of a sudden it kind of went back to normal and nobody talked about it. It was like the elephant in the room. I was leaving, I was going to another school. Nobody talked about it. I think by that stage, I was feeling pretty broken. I just Yeah, I didn't talk about it to anybody. Um, and the thing that resonates so much and that came back so much when I wrote the book was that thing of, why did nobody sit down and say, what happened? What did you do that for? I don't know that I would have been able to articulate it in the way I just have. That comes from the perspective of being a parent and a teacher and knowing that children can bottle things up and bottle things up, and then it'll come out in some huge raging tantrum over a broken biscuit, something completely trivial. And then the tears will come, and you'll discover that somebody's been bullying them in school. Well, there's always a story, there's always a reason. Those sort of explosions don't come from nowhere. There's always a story behind it. And you've just got to make space for a child to come to you when they're ready and in their own time and say, there's something I can't cope with. And so I can feel the compassion now for the child that I was, and just an awareness that I have my trigger points. I have moments where I think I can't cope anymore. I've got to back off, or I've got to find a place to be grounded, to be safe. And I know how to do that because I'm a grown up now. I didn't know how to do that when I was 10. And I think, that particular shaming was just outrageous.
Yeah.
Just outrageous. Should never have. Terrible, terrible thing to do to a child.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It's, shocking story and and thank you for your courage in sharing it and writing the book. And yeah, like I said, I read it and yeah, at parts laughed, with the story of the skipping,
Mm.
and I cried with some of the stories and just feeling a lot of anger. It's like, so yeah. And for me, I know the schools have changed a lot, and yet there's still no parents for me. There's still, my understanding from what I'm hearing is that yes, the abuse is not coming from the teachers anymore. It's coming from the other children. So that's still because it's still one adult for 50 children.
Yeah,
So, we're not going to hear what's actually happening for another 27 years. And
no.
I am speaking to lawyers and they're saying we're still prosecuting. I'm working with children who are in their teens in these schools. So it's still happening.
Mm.
And so, yeah. I mean, as we start to wrap up, is there one final thing you'd love to share, Karen?
Oh, I think that one of the reasons I really wanted to write it was that sense of having been on a journey that really did open up new understanding and new worlds for me. And I mean, lots of people these days talk about your wound becomes your superpower.
Mm.
And I feel like there are elements of my story that have given me enormous power as a teacher to be able to understand and take in what's happening in a room full of children. And I spot the ones who aren't coping. And I've been right on a few occasions. I think I'm a little bit hypervigilant like that. But I think having told the worst story of all, just briefly to tell the story that I started off with, that moment where I walked up to that building. And it was about this time of year, it was about October, it was quite cold, there was quite a lot of wind, and the building was empty and silent, and seeing all that in my head. And I thought, right, I can do something about this. I can I can process this and I can put it to rest. It's all in my head. It's not in there anymore. And this image came to me. It, I don't think I've ever been to a workshop about the inner child or anything like that. I've had a vague awareness that it was a concept. Didn't have any idea that this was going to happen, but I had this powerful, powerful image of this, what I call the pencil sketch child. It was just like an outline of a hunched figure sitting at the base of the pillar, one of these two massive stone pillars where the iron gates were. And I just knew there was this massive, not massive, there was this small broken part of myself that I'd abandoned the day I left, not going there, not having anything more to do with you. You're the violent, nasty, horrible part of me, and nobody's ever going to know about you again. And I felt like I suddenly realized that I have carried this image of myself my whole life as having to hide the fact that underneath whatever friendly, creative exterior I might project to the world, there is a terrible, awful, shadowy, nasty, violent child. And I saw it in that image. And again, I had a perspective on it for the first time in my life. No, 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 no. That's just wrong. I have to process that in whatever way it needs to be processed. And I stood there and I thought, what do I do about this image? I've worked with imagery and dance work and theatre work. It can be immensely powerful, not a thing to run away from. So I thought, come on, what can I do? So in my head, I dialogued, what do you want to do right now? What do you need from me? And I had this image of her actually saying, yeah, I'd like to go off down the path that I loved. I'd like to go running in the fields. And I had intended to turn around and walk back down the drive over the cattle grids and back into the town. And I had this image that she wanted me to go carry on onto the estate and go through this fence. And I could not remember in my memory where that gate led. But I had this idea that I would do if I kept this image in my head. And the image stayed with me for about 20 minutes, not long. And as soon as I'd gone through this gate and I started walking down this path, I realized that I could get off the estate by walking down to the river, along a field, and out through the gates. So I thought, right, I'm going to do it that way. Yeah, I might get muddy, but who cares? And I remembered there was this enormously happy day where the whole school, on a very hot summer day, had walked down that path to the river. And we'd supposed to only just paddle, but somebody had just thrown themselves into the river. And because there was no shouting, we all did it. But before anybody knew what was happening, we were all in our gym kits. We just plunged into this cold river on this hot day. And it was this deliciously naughty but refreshing and wonderful thing to do. And there was nothing the staff could do about it. I think they just kind of gave into it. And we all tramped up back up the hill, dripping wet. I think we had to shed all our wet stuff outside the back doors. But it was just glorious. And it was like that was the beginning of a journey of reintegrating a part of myself that I just rejected wholesale, not going there, and checking it wherever I found it. Yeah, just noticing where my self-image would go very dark and very negative, and thinking, no, stop it. That's a nasty learned response, and I'm going to move beyond that and look at, I'm not perfect, but I've got lots of things in my life that I want to be proud of, and I do care, and I would never in a million years treat a child the way I was treated. So I have to change karma that way, if you like, by just meeting life as it happens. and behaving in a more compassionate way.
Mm.
So yeah, that
Okay.
story was huge for me. It was very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, and your book, I really recommend, people go and buy your book. You can get it on Amazon. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and speaking and, having the courage to share this. And I think it's so powerful that personally, when I hear other people's stories, it awakens something within me that I've forgotten. So thank you for sharing what you have in the book and in today's conversation. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you.